Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Sunday, March 22nd, and Saturn has just entered the sign of Aquarius. This is a big deal in the astrological world. This is a headline in the astrological world. I know that we've been talking a lot about the coronavirus, and astrologers certainly are trying to help people make sense of the coronavirus by way of looking at all of the transits. I'm going to talk, of course, about Saturn entering Aquarius today in relation to the coronavirus, but we're also going to try to look beyond that to the broader archetypal mythic symbolism of Aquarius and Saturn's comfort zone in the sign of Aquarius and a few other things to help us understand not just what's going on right now with Saturn entering Aquarius and all of that, which is interesting and we will cover, but also what you can expect for the next 2.5 years, because Saturn's ultimate sojourn through Aquarius will take about that long. So that's what we're going to do. And first, I'd like to show you a picture of the transit on the screen, just in case you, just to give you a visual of it first. So let me go ahead and put this up. Here we are. So it happened last night. I think East Coast time, it was just after midnight, if I remember correctly. So we're just, we're on the day of Saturn's entrance. And here you can see Saturn having just entered at 0 degrees of Aquarius. Now, let's just start by giving you a little sense of how long this lasts. So typically it takes Saturn, like I said, about 2.5 years to go through each sign. But with this particular transit, we're going to see Saturn get up to the 1st degree of Aquarius before actually stationing and then turning retrograde and dipping back into Capricorn for a while. So around May 10th, 11th, and 12th, you're going to see Saturn station and turn retrograde in Aquarius. So between now and about the middle of May, Saturn will be plowing forward into the 1st degree or so of Capricorn, and then it's going to turn retrograde. It will then be in that 1st degree of Aquarius, 0 degree of Aquarius, all the way until about the very end of June and beginning of July. So it dips back in between July 1st and 2nd into Capricorn. So you could say that between now and the beginning of July, we are getting a taste for Saturn in Aquarius. Now, when Saturn goes back into Capricorn, it's going to be there for a little bit. It retrogrades back. Let me go back here just a little bit more. So it retrogrades down to at about 25 degrees, and that will be happening from the early part of July all the way to, here we go, about, what did I say, late September? Sorry, guys. There we go. So about late September is when it stations. And then it turns direct. And then it's going to move forward again and finally come back into the sign of Aquarius by December. So it dips back in about mid-December. I could give you the exact date here too. Let's go back. It's going to be between the 16th and the 17th that it transitions back into Aquarius again. So that's the general trajectory between now and July, Saturn in Aquarius. Then from July to mid-December, we're going back into Capricorn territory. And then we come back in mid-December into Aquarius. And then at the very outset of that transit, Jupiter is going to ingress into Aquarius in mid-December, and the two planets will conjoin with one another at the winter solstice, which is pretty remarkable. So by the end of the year, we're in a completely different territory. Now, in this talk, I am going to cover a few different topics, and I'm doing a part 2 as well, probably tomorrow or the next day. Today, we're going to talk about the general themes of Aquarius and Saturn's relationship with this sign, the mythology and archetypal dimensions of this sign, and things to watch for in a general sense. In part 2, I'm going to be taking a look at previous Saturn in Aquarius events in the mundane or collective sphere of life. I'll also be looking in part 2 at Saturn square Uranus and Taurus, because that's one of the bigger transits that Saturn will make to another slow-moving planet. We're already going to be feeling that now in the next couple of months, because their square will be pretty close. So we'll take a look at Saturn square Uranus and Taurus, and we'll also foreshadow Pluto entering Aquarius. Pluto is, of course, going to be following Saturn into Aquarius, and a couple of years from now. By that time, Saturn will be into Pisces, but Pluto will move into Aquarius. So we might getting a little bit of a foreshadow, and we'll talk about Jupiter and Saturn's conjunction in Aquarius at the end of the year. So that'll be all in part 2. Like I said, today we're going to talk about the general themes of Aquarius. So it's important to remember that Saturn as a planet is naturally at home in both the signs of Capricorn and Aquarius, which makes this a pretty comfortable and well-dignified Saturn. That's good because that means that you tend, not always, but you tend to get either a stronger Saturn or a better behaved Saturn. A better behaved Saturn is going to exhibit qualities that are more virtuous expressions, you could say, of the Saturnine or Saturnian archetype. Discipline, focus, maturity, seriousness, respectability, being dutiful, hardworking, grounded, these kinds of Saturnine words that I'm sure you've probably heard before if you listen to astrology podcasts often. You could also think of Saturn as being in its own sign as being a little bit more like a wise grandmother or grandfather. There's a sense of the veteran experience of time and wisdom, of age and maturity. Saturn can also give us an objective, distanced, sober view of things that can be very, very helpful. It can help us take stock of what we are and what we are not. And Saturn's negation, Saturn's way of saying no to things, can help us further refine what we are, just like the negative space of a painting or a sculpture helps you shape more specifically the piece of art that you're making. So Saturn may say no, but its no is a secret yes if we think about the process of Saturn limiting us and defining us more. By our limits, we are more precisely defined. And when we find our niche in life, there's a way in which we thrive. There's a way in which we become abundant, and we feel organic happiness when we've found our place. I see people all the time. One of the main things that they may suffer from in looking at charts all the time is having an abundance of gifts, ambitions, abilities, opportunities. And while it's nice, there is also a comfort in and a real sense of peace in being able to narrow the field of possibilities a little bit more. So that's a real virtue or benefit of Saturn. Now, sometimes it can be a drag, of course, but that's one of the potential benefits of Saturn. So that's one way of thinking about it. Now, I have a quote that I'm going to read to you. Let's see if I've got it. Here we go. Okay, here it is. I had to take a second to find it. Here's what James Hillman wrote about Saturn. As I've grown older, I've come to realize that the curses, the frustrations, and the character faults visited on me by Saturn mean something completely different than what I thought when I was younger. I took them literally as curses, and I cursed my stars for not giving me what I believed I needed and wanted. That is, I cursed Saturn, to use the old language. But it isn't Saturn who curses us, we curse him. We make him into that poor, shunned, limping old god because we don't understand his mode of blessing. What a curse it must be to keep giving gifts that are received as punishments. The faults and frustrations he visits on us are his way of keeping us true to our particular image. No way out. The old lore attributed the last years of life to Saturn. That makes sense. Only now can I begin to reconcile myself with and not rebel against what I am and what I am not. So one really nice thing about a well-dignified Saturn is that it helps us refine, sometimes through elimination, sometimes through negation, sometimes through those cosmic expiration dates that appear in some particular area of our life, showing us who we are and who we are not. So Saturn can really be thanked for this. Saturn helps us get to our yes, this is what I am, this is my specific image. As Hillman says, there's no way out. It's interesting that Saturn is a very close relationship to fate, not because Saturn is the ruler of fate. All planets participate in the depiction of our fate. But Saturn is related to fate because Saturn is necessity. And fate comes into our lives and we are bound to it. We can't escape it because of necessity. When we say the word fate, of course, we get scared and we think that means, well, that means I'm bound to something bad. That means you're bound to good things as well. It's the force of necessity that constrains us to be exactly who we are until we've played out the drama of our lives, our character, our calling, our destiny, our blessings, and our curses on the stage of life. We can't really we can't really understand what their gifts and blessings are. So in a sense, Saturn makes sure, confines, restrains, limits us to the plot line, to the characters and the setting on the stage of life that we were born into. And it says, this is what you're exploring. If we have the audacity to remember that we are eternal spiritual beings, then, like Hillman says, they're all gifts, they're all blessings. The gift or blessing of a well-dignified Saturn is just a little bit easier to recognize that necessity as the insurance of fate is a blessing, that it is bringing us closer toward a kind of seed image that we were born with of character, calling, fate, that we are meant to be here and to see and explore and taste the fruit of. Even if that fruit is a bitter fruit, it's still wisdom and time and experience are ultimately there if we trust the process. And this is a Saturn that, oftentimes people feel like they're just a little bit more inclined to trust the process with. Same thing with Saturn and Capricorn. There's a sense of necessity. There's a sense of, this is happening, it's difficult, but I somehow know that it's right, that it's true, that the force of necessity made this be so. So, a well-dignified Saturn means a lot of other things too. It can mean that Saturnine themes or symbols get stronger, and not always for the better. You typically have two different meanings of a planet being in its own sign. The planet in its own sign means stronger, more able to act out its own significations. Like Venus, let's say Venus is, if Venus represents beauty, then, let's say Venus is in your ascendant and you have some very pleasing or pleasant or beautiful quality about your personality or even your physical appearance. How you use that is important, because that might be a really strong feature in you, that you're very pleasant or pleasing. Maybe you sing nicely, maybe you look really beautiful, or you're really cut or something like that. But how you use that determines whether or not it's something more than just a strong Venus. If you use that in service of vanity, then it might be strong, but not necessarily virtuous, right? So that's the idea, is that it can mean strong, or it can mean a little bit more prone to the more virtuous side of a planet. Venus's dark side is vanity, lust, desires that are self-destructive, etc. Superficiality. The higher vibration of Venus, you might say, would be that which is both beautiful and true, both beautiful and good, both beautiful and just, other qualities that Venus embodies, specifically through Libra with some of those too. So anyway, so you're always thinking about Saturn right now as strong, but also potentially Saturn as capable of demonstrating its more virtuous qualities. And one of the most virtuous parts of Saturn is the ability to help refine and shape things and limit things, so that the force of necessity working upon us brings us closer to the essence of something. We need a force that says what something isn't to get closer to what something is. And Saturn is that paradoxical force. So well-dignified Saturn works like this. Now, let's talk about Aquarius a little bit. There's a number of really interesting things we can say about the sign of Aquarius. One of the stories that, of course, is associated with Aquarius, the water bearer, the water pourer, you've seen that image before, is the story of Ganymedes. And Ganymedes was obviously, if you know this story, I've talked about this story before when I did my Sun in Aquarius video, I think it was. Ganymedes was the sort of beautiful and sort of chosen special youth that Zeus abducts, falls in love with, and abducts. And takes him up to Olympus to be his cupbearer, his wine pourer, his water pourer. So the image, one of the image often associated with Aquarius is that hey, that water pourer, that's Ganymedes. What is that? What's unique about this story? Well, Ganymede has been talked about by archetypal psychologists and mythologists, people like Joseph Campbell and so forth, as representing, there's this interesting way in which gods in Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and early in mythology all over the world will often covet something that human beings have. And human beings will often covet things that the gods have. For example, Prometheus, in a sense, covets the fire of the gods. He thinks that they're using it. They have something that's, and they're using it in a way that's unfair. They're not sharing in a way that's good. And so some people will see Prometheus as a hero who steals the fire of the gods and enlightens humanity through his fire theft. Of course, he's also a transgressor, and in some ways can be seen as a sort of Luciferian character who is, you saw the movie The Lighthouse. It's a very Promethean story. It came out recently with Robert Pattinson and, what's his name? Gosh, I can't remember his name. Willem Dafoe. Very Promethean story. And we know that transgression, that lust for the light, that lust for the gods, that lust for eternity can degrade a person and can lead to, it's a kind of mortal, it's a kind of mortal sin. And there's a way of, that Prometheus ends up getting punished and his guts are torn out by the eagle. And I think it's an eagle, maybe it's a vulture eagle. I think it's an eagle. Anyway, his insides are torn out, put back together, only so that he has to repeat the whole thing over and over again. We have tons of stories about people thirsting after divine, eternal things. But from within the standpoint of the mortal world, that can often lead to problems. And we also have stories about the gods wanting something or coveting something about mortality. So it's an interesting dynamic. Let's talk for a moment about how this can play out as Saturn moves into Aquarius and how some of these themes can become really prevalent. Well, if Ganymedes represents the potential of humanity that even the gods are impressed with. Wow, look at this, the most beautiful, potent, promising, why do we say promising? Because it's a youth. What is youth? Youth is promise and hope. So the gods want this and take it away. They abduct him. Zeus abducts him. And in a sense, Ganymedes represents that potential of the human race to be favored by the gods, to be favored by, something of a higher nature. At the same time, we could say that the result of Ganymedes' abduction is that he is now alienated from the rest of the human race, and that this can provoke a kind of jealousy. This can provoke a kind of envy. One can feel favored by the gods and envied by humans, and not being fully at home in the gods, being a servant, and being envied by your fellow humans leaves you in a kind of no man's land. It leads to a sense of divine alienation, of not being fully God and of not being fully mortal. Well, these are metaphors in a sense for what we're living with as human beings all the time. We're spirit souls in a temporary frame. So we feel that tension of being of two natures at once all the time. And Saturn as a planet is very closely resembles the conflict, tension, or polarization that we often feel between the godlike parts of us and the mortal parts of us. Saturn is, of course, the planet associated with the aspect of opposition in astrology, and Saturn is the most distant planet, most dimly lit, sitting on the edge or the border between the visible and the invisible, between the realm of the planets and the heavenly domain beyond, the stars. And so, as a gatekeeper between things, Saturn has a duality that's built into it. The duality of Saturn, in this case, could be the duality between the eternal and the mortal. In a very similar manner, the moon will carry some very similar significations. For example, the moon, as the closest planet to Earth, um, gives us the division between what's called the sublunary sphere, which is the realm of karma, the realm of the Earth, and the higher realm of the planets. In this way, when people reincarnate, in many traditions around the world, it's said that if they sort of have evolved to a certain point, then they'll pass beyond the moon. And if not, they'll go to the moon and be bounced back here for reincarnation. So the moon is a similar boundary, a demarcator of boundary between the realm of karma and fortune in the ancient heavenly spheres model and the higher planets, the more divine realms. But Saturn depicts one that's even farther away, that's even more distant, truly beyond even the realm of the planetary gods, so to speak. This is why Saturn is associated with the 12th house traditionally. It has its joy there. It rejoices in the 12th house, which is a liminal space. It was called metakosmos by ancient astrologers, which meant a world between worlds. Saturn carries many of the classical significations of Neptune prior to Neptune being around. And when Neptune was discovered, what do you know? It was in a conjunction with Saturn. So a lot of ancient astrology, we have a lot of Neptunian symbolism that actually, sort of also belongs to Saturn. And I don't think we need to do away with it. Now, that's a different topic, but Saturn as this boundary marker will also demarcate the boundary between the humane and material concerns of the body politic and life on Earth, and that which is eternal or ideal in some sense. And this division, this polarization between the two is often amplified because we have something demarcating a boundary or a wall between the two in Aquarius. And that tension is represented in the character of Ganymede, who is beloved of the gods, but alienated from people. The most elevated of people, but doesn't no longer fits in, is with the gods, but isn't necessarily one of them. So that division is really present. And in the same way as human beings, we make cities built on ideas and dreams and visions of our potential. The New Age movement was first called the Human Potential Movement. It's not totally surprising that the idea of the age of Aquarius is a modern invention in astrology. Many people don't know that. Many people think that the age of Aquarius has some very ancient historical backing, and actually the calculation of astrological ages in ancient astrology was very different. In fact, if you want something to read on the topic, which you may find you may find this interesting. Let's see if I even have a quote in here. I may. No, I can't. I thought I had it. Maybe had the page bookmarked, but I don't. But this is called Astrology and Popular Religion in the Modern West: Prophecy, Cosmology, and the New Age Movement by Nicholas Campion. And it's tracking out some of the sort of deviations from the tradition that happened in modern astrology in relationship to the idea of ages, like the age of Aquarius. So anyway, the age of Aquarius, the human potential movement, these are, of course, appropriately, these are ideas that come about, that take hold at a moment in time where human beings have been for several hundred years. The Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Enlightenment, the widespread, globalism and the global economy, things like that. Human beings have been interested in progress in the future. And what's behind that? We're driving toward an ideal of perfection. It's utopian thinking. It's idealistic thinking. It's not bad necessarily. Some of it's probably, we'll in 100 years, we'll look back and say, well, we did some really good things, just like we can say about what we've done over the past 100. But there's also always this tension that exists, because insofar as we focus on the future and we focus on progress and the ideal, we are alienating ourselves from what is, from what we are. What we ought to be always will alienate us in some ways from what we are. Does it have to? That's a question. That's a real question. I know that as a spiritual person, it's very hard to play the game of life where we're trying to get better at our faults and flaws. We're trying to improve as people while also, being rooted in what we are and practicing forgiveness and grace. We're not very good at it, I don't think, as a collective at the moment. If you think about it, so much of what's happening during this coronavirus moment is giving us a very clear picture of the faults and flaws in idealistic thinking, in privileging technology. We privilege, in some ways, the destruction of the earth and the environment when we privilege consumerism and technology and the kind of science that we're putting into the kinds of things that we're putting into. Life gets more ideal, but if the ideal is rooted in a feeling of not being happy with what is, of living within our means, of living with more mindful relationship to the planet or the earth or to one another, then it's our very notion of progress that alienates us from the very ground we stand on. And this is why people say that Aquarius sometimes, you'll hear people say, Aquarians love humanity, hate people. It's like, I have a full family full of Aquarians. My dad, my mom, and my sister. So I'm very familiar with the Aquarian vibe. My midheaven's in Aquarius personally in my birth chart. So there's a way in which that idealism, it's good, it looks good, it appears good, but it also tends to alienate and divorce us and separate. And the future, when the future and the present are polarized with one another, present bad, future good, past bad, future good. Any way that we play with time like that and we polarize. Remember, Saturn is a planet that's related to time. This is why Saturn is also related with a dual, double-faced Roman god Janus, if I'm remembering, I think it's Roman, who faces both forward and backwards simultaneously. Planet Saturn is a planet of divisions and separations and oppositions. So Ganymede is an image of progress, an image of enlightenment, an image of the future, of human potential, of the new age, of the age of Aquarius. But such inventions often come either by polarizing itself with the past or with the present, in which case we suffer. We suffer from dissociation. And what is the phenomenon spreading all around the world right now? Social distancing, right? As Saturn enters Aquarius, and we have Pluto coming soon to enter Aquarius as well. Social distancing. Now, social distancing can be a good thing too. For 10 years in my life, I spent participating in studying, practicing ayahuasca shamanism. It's not something that's in my life any longer. I can't personally recommend the path to anyone, but it was a path of study for me, and it was a big part of how my spiritual cultivation of bhakti yoga got started, and astrology, among other things. And there's something that happens when you do what's called a dieta. Dieta will be like in isolation, more or less, drinking plant medicines and drinking in ayahuasca ceremonies and eating very bland food and really kind of cleansing at a very deep level. And this cleansing process is done in isolation. And as one sits in isolation, dieting the plants and drinking in ceremonies and being mostly silent, no technology, one suddenly becomes very aware of the voice of the spirits, the plant medicines, or what we might call the active forces of the psyche, the archetypes, the powers of the gods, of divinity itself, of God. So these channels tend to open up when we isolate ourselves, when we take on a bland diet, when we sort of divorce ourselves from the senses. If you've ever been on something like a Vipassana retreat, it might be similar, or a meditation retreat, or a silent meditation retreat. Just ever gone into a radio-free, no technology zone? We have one not far from us in West Virginia that we like to go, or Virginia or West Virginia that we like to go to. So you know that what happens when you're in this space is that subtler dimensions of communication start opening up, subtler levels of awareness start opening up. You wouldn't think Saturn would be involved with, mystical, subtle states, but absolutely Saturn is. Because if you put yourself, like the Hermit card in Tarot, a Saturnine card, if you put yourself in isolation, your radio antenna grows up about 50 feet higher. You know what I mean? And that isolation, that seclusion can be very eye-opening. Now, over 10 years of drinking ayahuasca, I drank in probably like at least 100 plus ceremonies. In the ceremonies that I was in, of course, one of the things that happens is you go very deeply into your own mind, into your own heart, into your own psychic material. And you, in some ways, also become a prisoner in that space. There's no way out. If you've ever been in any kind of psychedelic situation before, I'm not talking about recreational partying here. I'm talking about something that's really intentional and hopefully sacred. You know that if you've been in that space before, that there's a way in which you can't leave. There's no place to go. As Hillman said about Saturn, there's no way out. And by being forced to sit in distance from the world, it's very easy to begin seeing its faults and flaws. It's very easy when forced into a situation of not being able to leave, no exit, being forced inward, that you come to see what's really there, the stuff that gets ignored because of the way that we just keep going and doing stuff. And on that level, when the heavenly spirits come in and give us vision to see what's there that we're running from, no way out, now you have to look at it, there is a tremendous amount that can be purged, released, understood, lessons that can come in. And for some people, it's torturous. It's very, very scary to not be able to leave and to have to look at what's there. This is why ayahuasca is so controversial. For one thing, it's not appropriate for everybody. It's not a cure-all. It's not, a lot of people, I think, misuse it. There was a point in my life where I had to basically say, I've got the message, I'm hanging up the phone. But the same thing is true for meditation. The same thing is true for prayer. When we make a life that is focused on the concentrated space, giving ourselves some parameters. I'm going to walk in a circle around the Buddhist shrine 108 times as I chant my rounds on my japa beads, or I'm, in my case, in Krishna Bhakti, I'm going to repeat the Hare Krishna mantra, for 90 minutes, 2 hours a day. When we put ourselves into the seclusion, the isolation of a focused, concentrated space, otherworldly things come through. Our divine spiritual part of us is able to come back and see itself in the mirror of the mind a little bit better. And what a gift that is. So Saturn can also, in Aquarius, just like Ganymede gets taken up to heaven or Prometheus steals the fire, there is this sense in which we all do need to be tapped into heavenly knowledge, heavenly information, so that we can grow, so that we can progress, so that we can shed this, this mortal coils, that these chains that bind us. And there is the sense of the need for spiritual freedom, potential, and a kind of futuristic sense of evolution. these things are actually a part of Saturn. Most people don't think that. They're like, oh, that's Uranus or that's something else. But not Saturn. But it's like, it's exactly as James Hillman said. Well, let's revisit that quote for just a second, if I can. Oh, no, I already closed it. The quote, but one of the things he said in the quote was, I used to think that these were curses, and now I understand that they were blessings. How bad that we always are cursing Saturn. Remember, if you ever want to just remember how beautiful and mystical Saturn is, take a look at one of those pictures of Saturn where you see the rings and the different on the different color spectrums. And I don't know, that always helps me. But it's the planet Saturn that, by giving us the isolation and the distance, the remoteness, and even, yes, some of the dissociation, is allowing us to amplify and increase the vibration of the spirit within us, which, if it gets overly entangled in mundane material things, does become diseased and does become sick. So it's a very funny duality where, we're living in the next couple of years in a period of time where that restless social idealism, that sense of potential and future and progress can become really strong. But that may not be a good thing. It can alienate us. It can actually distance us from one another even more. On the other hand, there is a way in which, for example, right now, many people who are in social isolation are going to start experiencing this maybe for the first time in their lives. Many of us who are maybe listening to this, who have had maybe lots of spiritual experiences, or we enjoy them, or we look for them. I might get into a sweat lodge, or, I might do something that is a forced period of containment to just sit. But it's rare that people actually seek out those things. We're missing largely initiations of these kinds. We don't value them societally. We think, oh, that's alternative health. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. So for a lot of people, the social distancing is not only social distancing, it's also something like a dieta. It's something like forced shamanic confinement. So I'm not saying that every single prison cell is an enlightenment chamber. I'm not trying to go that far, but I am saying that it can be, and not only that, but also some of the ways in which over the next couple of years, there's a growing sense of being different and alien from others. And this often happens when the almost the trajectory of the global plot, or the community plot, or the family plot line, or the plot line that's in the news, or the politics, the more that we start feeling like our humanity, our both our humanity and our spiritual essence is divorced from feeling any kind of communion with those storylines, we start to feel alienated from the world. This feels like the world's heading off on some kind of Stephen King novel, plot line. And I'm not sure I'm interested, or whatever the plot line is that's being sold to us in the collective, where we're going and why it's important and da-da-da. And we just start going like, you know what? I don't relate to this. Whether you're on the left or the right, that feeling could really emerge in the next couple of years that I just don't relate to this. And hence alienation can grow in a general sense, where we don't feel like we have a purpose or a part to play in the story that's being told. That can be a depressant for many people. On the other hand, just like the dieta, just like the forced seclusion, some of the most amazing art, some of the most amazing spiritual growth and development, some of the most amazing cultural developments can come through that feeling of alienation. I believe it was, let me just pop open this really quick. Yeah, it was Nina Simone. You think about a really interesting person. Nina Simone had Saturn in Aquarius in the first house. You think about someone who felt alienated from the general plot line. If I remember correctly, it was both in her own family that condemned the type of music she was into, as well as the general population because she was an African American woman. But the idea in her chart that I've explored in some of my classes before, is that it is exactly the alienation that she feels that also makes her such an instrument of creativity. We can see this in other places in the history of astrological literature. For example, the Renaissance astrologer Ficino, who wrote a great deal. First of all, he helped restore, revitalize, and pass the torch to the Platonic tradition, the Neoplatonic tradition, as a kind of like translator. But he also wrote a lot about astrology. And one of the things he said about Saturn was that astrologers were children of Saturn, that artists, and basically he was the one who said, look, Saturn is related to melancholy, and melancholy is, although it is a kind of can be like Eeyore, you know what I mean, from like Winnie the Pooh, it can be kind of a drag and a depressant and hard on health, hard on the mind, feeling alienated from the world. It can also be the generative force of the imagination, because where there is a buildup of pneuma, pent up pneuma inside, then that mental, emotional, trapped energy starts pouring through us in ways that we can't hold it in any longer. The constraints can't be held. Polarization works like that. Polarized things, for Greek philosophers, the polarities in Platonic thinking lead to the tension leads to the creation of a third. You got the two in a tense relationship, and their tension leads to the birth of a third. So similarly, the restrictive and sort of oppressive tension of Saturn in the next couple of years in a strong sign where it's well dignified, yes, we could start to feel alienated, a little bit more aloof, a little bit more distance from the world. I don't really relate to this, but that can come also by it can mean a buildup of imaginative power that then comes bursting forth, and you can see really tremendous things in spirituality, the arts, culture, all of the places where soul usually comes through. And one way in which we can see this, although I'm going to talk more about previous Saturn and Aquarius events in part 2, is the last time that Saturn was Aquarius, early 90s. How about, at least in the United States, how about the grunge movement, the alternative rock movement? You have bands like Nirvana. And what is that art about? Well, in many ways, that art is about a feeling of being, I'm not able to relate to this world. It seems like a sham. I feel dissociated from it. And yet, Kurt Cobain, think about him, right? He's Ganymedes. He's just the perfect example of that. He's just sort of a glowing angel. So anyway, of course, he had Saturn in his chart conjoined with an exalted Venus. But so you could think also of Aquarius as that sense of not being able to relate, that also feeds back sometimes in forms of anarchy or grunge or punk or edgy ways of saying, I reject the status quo. But just like Saturn is prone to do, Saturn can also represent the status quo. Saturn represents feigned appearances. Why? Because the structure isn't the substance. Do you know what I mean? The structure of the law is not the spirit of the law. And rules don't help us to embody usually the spirit of anything that we're learning. You learn the rules of a game. Yeah, but let's get into the game. You learn the rules of music, but yeah, let's play the instrument. You learn the rules of astrology. Yeah, but let's listen to the voice of the oracle. So Saturn is a planet that also represents feigned appearances. One of the reasons that distance is such an important feature of Aquarius and Saturn's time in Aquarius is because it sees the difference. Remember the polarity. It sees the difference between form and substance. Or at the very least, it sees the lack of substance, the negation. It's a via negativa. So it sees the world and it says, not this, not that. And that can be something that takes us to spirit. The path of Jnana Yoga is similar. By looking at the world and saying, that's not spirit, that's fake, that's phony, that's false. False advertising, right? Fake news, as everybody is saying. But think about it. The fake news thing has come while Saturn's been really empowered. It's easy to negate things when Saturn is, you know, in sort of in an empowered state. And that can be a good thing because it can drive us closer to the truth. We have to be very careful because it can also drive us closer to a complex that is only about saying no. And saying no is not a positivistic framework from which most of us need to work in order for spiritual life to be satisfying. Just like saying, look, you can't just limit bad foods. Why? Because the soul naturally desires pleasure. The natural desire of the soul is love, is happiness, is attachment to others and things that are meaningful and healthy and good that make us happy. You can't take that away from the soul. It's endogenous to the soul. Saturn sometimes will have us believe that only by saying no to things that lack substance are we made substantial. No, you're just made into a complainer. Do you know what I mean? And you know this as well as I do. It's like, look, how many times have you ever been around someone who's really artistic, or really smart, but all they know how to do is criticize things that lack substance. All they know how to do is point out the faults or flaws. They're expert judges, they're expert critics, they have high taste and high standards, but mostly what you get from them is a sense of the superiority of their judgments and their ability to say, no, that's not real, that's phony, or that's not quite good enough, or whatever. Yeah, but you need to have something in your life where you are absolutely a fanboy, a fangirl. You're just nuts and you overlook flaws, you know what I mean? And you don't make the judgments. So the thing we have to be careful about, in other words, with Saturn in Aquarius is can be very easy to spot that which is lacking substance, that which is not so great, that falls short in some way. And that may be a pathway toward what is good, beautiful, true, just, satisfying, fulfilling, connected. But typically for most of us, we don't find enlightenment simply by saying no to things, just like we don't find health only by saying no to things that we don't like to eat. You have to add in some flavor. You have to add in some tasty food. Maybe it has to be healthy food. But it's better to add healthy food than to simply restrict unhealthy food. Restriction for most of us is not a path to enlightenment. Restriction can be a way of safeguarding the practices of the soul that bring pleasure and happiness. And that's one of the big lessons that Saturn brings in general. Saturn is not enlightenment. None of the planets are enlightenment, but Saturn can contribute to the journey of enlightenment that each soul is on by virtue of helping us safeguard against those things that lack substance, against those things that are false, or that we have to look at really critically and rationally and from a distance in order to say no to. That's not me. That's not going to help me. That won't feed me. That won't make me happy. So negation plays a role, but it isn't the final answer. In Bhakti, we say, look, the only answer is love. Love is personal, and love embraces all dualities. It does not eliminate differences or distinctions between dualities. It completes them in wholeness. So, for example, have you ever had a time in your life where something really, truly painful happened? Doesn't it feel better to recognize that it's okay for it to be painful and difficult and terrible? And aren't we also wise enough and just paradoxically beautiful enough to be able to say, and it's also beautiful that this is happening? Why are we so insistent on, why do we, it's like we safeguard our traumas. We dissociate further when we try to safeguard our traumas against being something other than trauma. You know what I mean? Like, our traumas are our beauties. Our beauties are our traumas and everything in between. So we have to be so careful because Saturn, a lot of Saturn dominance right now is also a lot of polarized, very black and white thinking. For example, how a person will define progress. It's very important. One of the most beautiful lessons about Saturn, once we start to embrace a path of love in our lives, is that everything that negates, everything that hurts, everything that cuts off, everything that traumas, severs, separates, that these things, if received by the eternal spirit soul within us, as elements of the real, the good, the just, the beautiful, the true, if we include it within rather than polarizing ourselves with it, then everything is added unto us. Everything that we're looking for comes to us in that way. So it's really important that we take up that attitude. And sometimes frankly, it's very hard to do so with Saturn. It's more comfortable to simply focus on, in Sanskrit, they say neti neti, not this, not that. To focus more intently on what isn't working or what's lacking substance, or where the ideal is compared to where we are now. So it can appear very erudite and sophisticated to be this way. And certainly Saturn in Aquarius can mean a real level up in our thinking, in our erudition, in our education, in our mental sophistication. It's a very lofty intellectual sign. But again, the same thing can be the vanity of the mind that distances itself from the world, that judges everything like an art critic that, frankly, needs to care more about being seized by the symphony than by speaking eloquently about what it was or wasn't afterward. So these are things to watch for. There's also a big, vast gap in Aquarius sometimes between the individual and the group. This has been talked about by astrologers for a long time. And why is that? Let's go back to Ganymedes for a second. Ganymedes is abducted by Zeus, taken up, and is now set apart from humanity. There is a way in Aquarius in which our mind, our spirit, our soul really can progress. Remember that isolation, that distancing, that purges, that puts the antenna up a little bit higher. And wow, you know what? The path of the philosopher, from Plato to the yogis to the Buddhists, the path of the spiritualist, the spiritual aspirant, is a lonely path. It does take us away from the crowds. It does take us away from the herd. It is a kind of social distancing. And association matters a great deal on that path. How can if we realize, oh, you know what? Wow, I have a spirit soul. It's like a little plant, and it's trying like a vine to grow up into heavenly realms of consciousness that exist. And that's the trajectory I'm on. And I have to water it. And what do I water it with? With mantra, with mindfulness, with spiritual friendships, with talking about spiritual things and filling my ears with spiritual sound vibrations, with living a life that is just about watering that plant and receiving the sunlight of spiritual matters so that the spiritual plant can grow. Association matters a great deal on that path. What we're watching, what kind of information we're taking in, who we hang out with. All of those things matter so much and will necessarily lead to some form of alienation or distancing. On the other hand, it's the exact same thing. If our growth, if our starry heavenly growth up to Olympus or whatever, starts thinking of itself as spiritually privileged, as spiritually above others, then our growth is based on judgment and rejection. Self-righteousness, in other words, and hypocrisy and the spirit of criticism and judgment will be underneath all of that. And so as we grow, the task is always really to grow in a way that increases our love for our fellow human beings, for the world, for the body as a temple, for the world as a temple. In other words, if you're growing upward, but the vertical plane isn't being enriched by the vibrations of your vertical growth, the horizontal plane, isn't being enriched by the vertical trajectory upward, there's a problem. And eventually what happens is we incur the wrath of the gods, because the gods, karmically, their administrative function in a sense is to punish us when we try to transgress our own nature. And our own nature, as we are growing, can't deny part of what it is. So that's why, for example, in Bhakti, we say, and I always draw on Bhakti because that's my faith practice. I respect that many of you have different faith practices. But in Bhakti, we say, look, everything in creation is meant to be used in service of spiritual life and in service of others and their highest welfare. So that's what we're ultimately trying to do. So if the growth upward that the Aquarian energy depicts is being done again through the rejection, we incur the wrath of the gods. That's hubris. It's a spiritual form of arrogance that will get us smacked down. And it's not bad to get smacked down. I mean, it's inevitable, right? It's not like today we think if you make a mistake that you should be fleeced of everything you have ever done or ever been forever, right? And it turns out that the process is a lot more graceful than that. We may not be that graceful, but the process of spiritual life and God is very graceful, and so are the gods, plural. So, as we grow, it's also inevitable that part of us will be like, I'm feeling better than people that lacks substance. Oh, how crappy that is, and like that. And then, that those little arrogances or whatever, those judgments, they get nicked away at if we keep practicing. And then the result is we start opening our arms wider, even as our, crown chakra is opening or whatever. So, I mean, not that I know about any of this, but you get what I'm saying. So, so the individual versus the group can be a very real thing. I want to end today by talking about two passages from James Hillman. This is from a collection of essays he wrote called City and Soul. And he writes here in a little section on human rights about the phenomenon of silence. And I think this is also important because Saturn is a planet not only of dim and distant places, but of quiet, still, silent places. So here's Hillman. Having linked silence with imagining and how wrong speech with injuring imagination, I now want to show both that imagining is important for human rights and that the basis of these rights lies in silence. Silence presupposes an interior life. When activity is stilled, stimuli are shut down and dulled, and the pressures of relatedness are relaxed, imagination germinates freely, in freedom. Thus, silence has political implications. Think about the silence we're dealing with right now. Interesting. Before the right to free speech, free press, free worship, and free elections is the right to remain silent. Because this right assumes the free person within, who speaks, who prints, who worships, and who votes, that individualized who shall not be abused, invaded, or constrained. Rights, according to our political notions, are inalienable. They are lodged in the individualized soul. And freedom, according to these same political notions, is exercised by this agent who has something to say or print, who votes personal choices and considers personal gods. All other rights require, first of all, an imagining someone who can consider alternatives, improvise actions, express values, and fantasize outcomes. Silence assumes the primacy of a psychic person. Inalienable rights are the powers of this inalienable person whose imagining mind has not been alienated. This notion derives from a view of soul which holds that it comes natively endowed. There is individuality from the beginning, and silence is a condition for its flourishing. The fear of silence, therefore, is not so much a fear of emptiness, the fear that should we be still, we would fall into that void of nothing to say or show or tell. Quite the contrary. The fear is of fullness, of the incredible, unpredictable, and freewheeling fantasies that are native to the mind and show themselves so readily in dreams. The fear is of our inwardness, which threatens to be an Aladdin's cave or a primeval forest teeming with wildlife. If silence invites the imagining agent on whom political freedom depends, then weakening the imagining agent weakens the roots of freedom without attacking the freedoms directly. Just get us talking all the time. There is no need to regress freedom of speech or assembly or the right to worship if there is no one at home with something to say or with the need to pray. Freedom implies someone who can imagine things otherwise. Totalitarian states submit imagination to doctrine. The individual imagination is harnessed and censored. Under these conditions of duress, silence stands out as a most precious right. It is clung to fanatically and literalizes into a paranoid secrecy that resists even torture. The human right to remain silent becomes a sacred obligation, a last-ditch defense of the soul. How else can we understand the incredible witness of silence unto death from Salem to Siberia, from Christian martyrs to underground radicals? And how else can we understand the reluctance to tell afterward of the horror endured under torture by its victims? Unspeakable, they often say. We can also begin to understand the repression in totalitarian states of the other freedoms, speech, assembly, worship. Sheer freedom without a responsive imagining agent runs riot and perverts into chaotic libertinage in a vicious circle of control or chaos. Freedom imagined as total release remains totalitarian. This idea of freedom is merely the imagination of a captive or a slave, indicating that the imagination is still captive, still slave to total solutions. The first step out of this totalitarian circle of control or chaos is not the restoration of political freedoms, but the restoration of imagination itself, so that it can adequately imagine freedom as located in the inward silence of a concentrated and responsive imagining agent on whom the free exercise of human rights depends. Whoa! He just blows my mind. I just love him. You think about Plato, right? In the cave, the prisoner in the cave who starts questioning the nature of reality, who eventually comes out of his chains and leads out of the cave. His questioning begins inwardly, in silence, in silent contemplation. And what he finds when he comes back and tries to talk to people about what he saw and tries to free them from their chains, speaking of the individual and the group, is that they respond to him with malice. That's not part of the program. That's not part of what we do. That's not part of what's normal. And they want to go on with the normal script. And what do they do to that individual? They silence them. But silence is an interesting part of this phenomenon of alienation that we've been talking about today with Aquarius, where we can feel like we don't have anything in common with the plot line anymore. And so we feel silenced, quiet. But that's where the imagination, where the pneuma starts building. That's when we come back to the soul as an imagining agent that is uniquely individual, is not a part of gender, is not a part of race, is not a part of class, is not a part of nation, right? A spirit soul that has been to many other galaxies, many other planets. Imagine. So we can come back to that sense of who we are, that we have become alienated from, through the silence that descends upon us when we feel alienated from the world we're living in, from any of the groups or material designations that we belong to, that we feel no longer fit us. These are things that come up in Aquarius, and one of the signs that you're moving in the right direction is sacred silence entering your life, sacred distancing. This is exactly what Hillman is talking about. That's how you know imagination is healthy sometimes. Now, of course, I'm not trying to at all suggest that different kinds of political rights or social rights and individual rights should be silenced. That's a very different conversation. But what we are talking about is, in some ways, remembering ourselves through not feeling like we fit in with a lot of the storylines of the world anymore, and coming back to a remembrance of ourselves as an imaginal being, as a soul. And then what we do with that matters a great deal. That's going back to what we said about growing upward while also growing on the horizontal plane at the same time. So then when we want to come back and not just say, well, I'm just not a part of this. I'm a spirit soul. I'm not a part of the world. I'm not a part of a race or a class or a gender or a creed or whatever. No, we want to come back to it, and hopefully come back to it with a more deeper communion or union with our soul. Here's one more that he says. Joseph Campbell once said that the gods are not in Greece or in books about myth, but instead right on the corner of Broadway and 42nd Street in New York, waiting for the light to change. They are facts of everyday life, not merely the glorious and frightening images printed so beautifully in Campbell's own massive works. This observation of Campbell's leads us to a very old question that has haunted those interested in myth, and that is, have the gods truly fled? But there is an even more necessary question. Can they leave the world? If they are the world as the powers within its variety, how can they be separated from it? Are they not the immortality of the world, giving every item of this world its inherent transcendence, its sublime enchantment, imagination, and beauty that is at once also fearful, cruel, enigmatic, and profoundly understandable? Why has the modern age accepted the thesis that the gods can simply up and go? Certainly their absence, if that is the case, cannot be due to our having deserted their groves and altars, failed their rituals and sacrifices, and forgotten their mysteries. They surely cannot be that dependent on what we do or don't do. How could they claim their superhuman authority in the cosmos if their presence or absence depends on our behavior regarding them? The gods of myth would then be nothing more than what both Orthodox religion and secular relativism insist, fictions of human fantasy. So the question turns again, who and what benefits from declaring the ancient gods dead or fled? Who wants them gone? And with them gone as well, all pagan feeling, all pagan forms of consciousness. One thing sure, both historically and logically, the absence of the gods allows the world to become res extensa, as Descartes called it, a mathematical space, calculable, adrift with a litter of soulless objects. All soul, mind, and consciousness condensed inside the human brain, putting nature at the disposal of the human will. So the other thing that's really fantastic about Saturn and the sign of Aquarius is that we can bring that which is godlike, that which is eternal, the archetypes, the forms, divinity. We can also bring it back and claim it back from some lofty, distant place that we feel that it's vanished to, or that is in the future, or that is gone somewhere, or that we feel alienated from. Because astrology helps us with that in amazing ways. You can go out to lunch with someone, and the moon can conjoin with Neptune, and you could end up having a very deep emotional conversation, and you can end up eating some kind of seaweed salad, and you're like, oh my god, this was a really emotional conversation that I had while eating some seaweed. You know what I mean? It was moon was conjoined with Neptune. In that sense, the gods are being brought right into the most tangible things. So the other thing we have to remember is that this whole idea of social distancing, this whole idea of the great gap or separation between the gods and humans, between progress and enlightenment and the ideal and the real, or whatever is right now. This can also be collapsed by recognizing that the gods are in us and live among us, and divinity is right here, though we often can't see it. And we often can't see it because we have become alienated from it. But that doesn't mean that once we start to develop or recultivate or connect to that divine essence, to the gods, often through some form of distancing, that we can't come right back in and start to repopulate the world with the power of myth, archetype, and with the power of soulfulness. That's really the goal, ultimately, that we're always trying to embody in our life, is to bring out within ourselves the inherent divinity so that we can also see it, share it, and commune with it all over the place, in our organs, in our body, in our diseases, in our victories, in our defeats. So I'll leave us with those thoughts. I hope that this has been interesting for you today, that you've enjoyed this meditation on Aquarius. I would love to hear your comments in the comment section. Are you someone who is coming up on your Saturn return, with Saturn in Aquarius, a second Saturn return? Do you have Saturn prominently placed in your chart? How do you relate to Saturn? Share some of your reflections. I'd love to hear them. And I look forward to part 2 in the next couple of days. Take it easy, everyone. Bye.